The answer is yes. Obviously. I have 4 major reasons that I'm going to run through today. But I wanted to make this video not just to say why it was worth the hype, but to frame this moment in time. This is the end of an era. There has never been a show like Game of Thrones. HBO has a little series where they interviewed a bunch of the Game of Thrones cast members called The Cast Remembers. They did a great job with it. I watched it all yesterday, and so many of them said something to this effect, but both Kit Harington and Emilia Clarke talked about how this was their 20s. And obviously, we're not in the show with them, but this marked my 20s. The way that Harry Potter marked my childhood era, Game of Thrones has marked my 20s. It started when I was 20. It's ending the year that I turned 29. I've been watching since the very beginning, since the very first episode. I watched them live from 2011 through 2019. And my first reasoning here, why it's worth the hype, is even when you don't really know what's going on in Game of Thrones, you care. And you care to such an extreme degree. And now, to an extent, we know what's going on. We always know what's going on. But until you rewatch it, you don't realize how much there is going on that you didn't know was going on. You jump into Game of Thrones Season 1, and they throw so many names at you, so many faces at you, so many actors. All of Season 1, I was confused about which one was Jon and which one was Robb. I hadn't read the books. There's so many of us that hadn't read the books, but we care because the performances are fantastic. The writing is out of this world. I mean, like, the dialogue in the first couple seasons, you really gotta rewatch to appreciate it. Because so much of it is talking about characters that at that time, names went right over our head. Rewatching Game of Thrones has been the most rewarding rewatch I've ever done. I watch a lot of TV. I love television. I love storytelling, and nothing has topped this rewatch because I see everything so much clearer now. Because again, I didn't binge the show. So remembering all these names, remembering all these characters and when they popped up and why they popped up, impossible over that long of a period of time, especially when this is not the only thing you're watching and you're not reading the books. If you binged it, that's another story. But like, seriously, for the entirety of Season 1, I think I called both Jon and Robb Robb. But like, that didn't matter. I knew who they were in their separate storylines. We all remember where we were when we watched Red Wedding. Never in my life has a television show done that to me. I was up on the couch screaming and sobbing. I couldn't breathe. And I was alone in the basement in my childhood home. I can picture it. I'm there, you know? We all remember the episode in King's Landing with Oberyn when he fought for Tyrion in Trial by Combat. I was up on a chair, watching it on a laptop, on a table, standing on a chair, screaming at it, just screaming. I remember when it was over, not remembering how I got up here. The show itself has really been an exercise in delayed gratification. When you watch the first season now, you remember how slow it is. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of world building happening around you. It takes a second to absorb all of it. In some cases, it takes a rewatch to absorb all of it. All of the things that you want to happen, that you project for all of the characters in the beginning, don't even start happening till Season 6. In that time, our characters grow and learn and become these intense, strong survivalists. It makes it that much better when they do the thing that you've been waiting for them to do. We all remember the moment when Dany finally used her dragon for something, you know? Dracarys. And that was just the beginning. Just the degree to which they make you care. It makes it worth the hype. I haven't even touched on the production value, how cinematic it is. My number 2 reason, and I kind of bulldozed into it, the show is great from start to finish. It is so rare that a show is phenomenal from start to finish. When it is, you have to treasure that. We have Breaking Bad, and Breaking Bad is another show that was a cultural phenomenon. It wasn't as long as Game of Thrones, and it wasn't a fantasy. It's harder for fantasy to break into the mainstream world like this has. But Breaking Bad was something that we would all talk about online the day after it aired. But the first show that I remember talking about online was Game of Thrones. It was the first time that not just me was tweeting about Lost or tweeting about Harry Potter, tweeting about something. It was the first time I watched it in April of 2011, and then I went online and Twitter, and people were talking about it. Like, I remember seeing tweets from V.E. Schwab and Cassandra Clare specifically about this episode, reacting. And it's so much fun. It makes the show so much fun, and it's so amazing to see that you're not the only one watching and reacting and having fun like this. It was the first time that happened for me. Now there are shows that people get excited about, but there are very few shows that take up your entire feed. Game of Thrones is one of those. Literally, last night, every single top US trend were Game of Thrones characters. Arya, Cersei, Sansa, Bran, Jaime. I took a screenshot because it blew my mind. fine. My favorite part, other than watching the episode now, has been going on Twitter and reacting with everyone afterward. Like reading everyone's tweets, being a part of something that everyone is excited about, that brings everyone together. It's so rare. There are so many shows, and we're all here for this one. My third reason I have here is that this show gets people into fantasy. A lot of us like fantasy in this book bubble. We love it. We embrace it. But in like mainstream world, so many people, when they hear fantasy, they're turned off immediately because they don't understand. You know, people just don't realize what fantasy is. Like a poignant, beautiful reflection of our lives, you know, of our world that makes you think. You know, that's what it is. It's just about characters just in another world that makes you think about your own world because it's just a reflection. Even Peter Dinklage, in his interview, he talked about how, you know, fantasy, it's usually more dragon than character. And I've heard stuff like that all my life from people when I try to convince them to read a fantasy book. And if that's your thought process, you haven't read much good fantasy. Good fantasy is about the character. Game of Thrones has gone so mainstream, people don't even realize they're watching a fantasy. Like, there are so many people, my sister watches Game of Thrones. My dad watches Game of Thrones. My dad couldn't even make it through Harry Potter, but he watches Game of Thrones, he's into Game of Thrones, he's excited about Game of Thrones. Guess what, everyone? You're into fantasy now. This is a good fantasy, and there are lots of other good fantasies out there. All yous out there who just realized you love a fantasy show, I'm just gonna express recommend you some books. Do yourself a favor and pick up a Brandon Sanderson book. My favorite is the Mistborn trilogy. If you're into romance, I recommend the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas or the Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas. If you're a teenager and you haven't picked up a Cassandra Clare book, highly recommend the Infernal Devices trilogy that starts with Clockwork Angel. Back to Game of Thrones. My final reason why Game of Thrones is worth the hype. I've already kind of stepped on this one as well, but it's that it brings us all together. This show is bringing so many of us that maybe don't have much in common together to be excited about something, and there's so much joy in that. I mean, it blew my mind to hear my dad talking about Cersei Lannister, like, in some depth at the Thanksgiving table this year. This show will live on for generations and generations as something that people love to go back and watch. There aren't many shows like that in general, but especially fantasy shows. There's a lot of sitcoms that we go back and rewatch, but other than Lost, I've never gone back and watched a fantasy. The character development that we've watched all of our leads go through is like incomprehensible when you try to think about it. You try to think about Sansa in the beginning. I hated her. I was so annoyed with her. She just reminded me of my younger sister. She's gone through so much growth and learned so much and so much pain. And now she's a badass bitch that I think is more fit to rule than a lot of these bozos. The strength of the Stark sisters and what they've gone through and how they've come together has been so inspiring to watch. Dany's journey has been so inspiring to watch. Characters like Yara have inspired the shit out of me. A lot of fantasy stories are male dominated, but in this story, we see these women thrown around and go through so much hardship, and then we get to watch them rise from the ashes stronger than ever to power. I mean, I've never watched something like that. Honestly, I've never seen something like that. The two other giant fantasy franchises on this level that you can compare are Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And Lord of the Rings, as amazing as it is, there's no ladies in there leading that brigade. And in Harry Potter, we have Hermione, but like, she's not our lead. It's Harry. Harry Potter is everything to me. But it's different. It's still so different watching Game of Thrones and seeing the women come out on top. Like, I can't put into words. As a woman watching this, I've never been so inspired watching Dany rise up against her brother, watching Dany keep going after Khal Drogo dies. Roadblock after roadblock, and she keeps rising above it and keeps going. Arya Stark, man, from the very beginning. I loved that girl. Just watching her fight. And Brienne of Tarth, when she defeated the Hound. Those moments mean so much to me. Yara, when the Greyjoy Island chose Yara to be their queen, and Sansa, like, she's Lady of Winterfell. And I honestly think, now this is the first time I'm getting into mild spoilers, but I think that this show has to end with one of these women on the throne. I know that technically, with these old rules, Jon Snow is the rightful heir to the Targaryen throne, but he's the Mad King's brother's son. And Dany is the daughter of the king. Like, in my eyes, she has way more right to the throne than Jon does. He's just the first male heir, you know? Like, fuck that shit. I love the idea of them being equals and ruling together that way, but in the end, I don't think it can just be a man on that throne, because this show has been so much about the strength of women. There are amazing male characters left, but the majority of the male characters that have went for the throne in this series have ended up dead. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Jon. I think he's fantastic. I just think from a storytelling perspective, it's gotta be no one, or it's gotta be a badass bitch. As much as I love Jon's story, I feel like he was brought back by the Lord of Light to die at the right moment for the right person to take the throne. I don't think the story will be as satisfying and as inspiring and as great if it doesn't end with a woman on the throne. Not Cersei, but anyone else. Gilly. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear about your Game of Thrones journey. When did you start watching? Have you been watching live? Did you do a rewatch? Was it as rewarding as it was for me? My name's Christine. Thank you so much for watching. I have a book coming out May 7th. It's called Again But Better. It's my debut novel. If you're interested in pre-ordering, the link is in the description. I make videos every Tuesday, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!